So translations published in book volumes have long been the primary focus of literary translation research. Other print media received far less attention, as Luc van Doorselaer already noticed 10 years ago, although the tide is turning, as this recent volume by Folica and others proves, and a medial turn sets forth an analysis of the role that media forms have played in the history of translation. In my paper, I will address periodicals, to be more precisely newspapers. My focus will be on translations of Russian literature in Dutch newspapers during the interwar period. First, I will discuss the periodical as a medium. Then I will provide some details on methodological issues and the outline of my research. And then I will showcase some preliminary results. To conclude, I will make a case for periodical publications, usually called feuilletons, to receive proper place in literary translations research agenda. Alain Vaillant was right to call literary research almost exclusive focus on book volumes, bibliolatrie, the worshipping of books. Of course, literature published in periodicals is a different way of consuming literature, but I believe we should look beyond the binary opposition between books and periodicals, as the boundaries aren't as sharp as one would expect. Periodicals are more difficult to access, but thanks to the digitalization, much of the material gathering dust on archives is now becoming available. Ephemeral as most consumer articles, periodicals had in many cases a much wider reach than books did. Some of them sold millions of daily copies. And historically, the production and consumption of literature is rather a continuum, with books sometimes being published in episodes and installments in periodicals that were sometimes published as collected volume afterwards. For example, this is an example of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, published in installments in the newspaper Het Volksdagblad in 1898, and soon afterwards published as an affordable book volume for the newspaper's readers. Drawing on the work of Margaret Beetham, I consider newspapers to be cultural institutions trying to make their world meaningful. You'll notice that she didn't name translators as actors in this process, although I believe they are a part of this. Newspapers make up a highly contextual environment. This page from 1932 shows Chekhov's story on the right-hand side, surrounded by news items and by a commercial for, and I quote, the healthiest of cigarettes. In the bottom corner, there's an editorial announcement that due to an abundance of advertising, they had to cancel most of the foreign news section. This illustrates at once that different interests were at stake, pointing out the importance of both discursive techniques in the mediating of cultural transfer. O'Connor calls for a comprehensive research on translations and periodicals, as even the scope of these translations remains a guess. Corpus-based research can provide an answer to that question, although it is a lengthy process. For my research on translated Russian literature in Dutch newspapers, I compiled a database with 1,853 translations of Russian literature, which is a large number, but the time frame is wide, and my database is not limited to one or even a few newspapers, but to all the ones I got access to. When assembling a corpus of translations and periodicals, one encounters several difficulties. Digitalization is extremely helpful, but when using large collections of periodicals, we need to assess the quantity of the collection, meaning what is missing. In some cases, bibliographical works on periodicals could help, and what has not yet been scanned. Secondly, we are relying heavily on queries, so we need to be able to verify the quality of the OCR, the optical character recognition, and the performability of queries. The queries themselves are another possible weak link. I use well over 100 queries, both generic, for instance, Russian or feuilleton, and names of authors, which is particularly challenging as Russian names tend to be distorted in the Latin alphabet. And in the end, we shouldn't forget that you only find what you look for. Serendipity clearly doesn't work for online newspaper databases. To tackle the highly contextual environment of the periodical, I have disclosed the database using both paratextual information and periodical codes. These codes are labels to distinguish distinct features of newspapers, such as ideological orientation and ownership, because not all newspapers were commercial at the time. Some were published by trade unions or political parties. When you process the publication rates, this coronavirus-like graph pops up. One can see that the translation virus is spreading rapidly in the beginning of the 20th century. The reproduction number increases exponentially. Most likely, this was due to the dominant variant of the virus, the short story. And today, I would like to focus on the time frame between 1917 and 1940. That is the second/third wave in the graph.
Sorry, Gaëtan,
yeah.
We are always seeing the first page of your presentation.
Oh, that's not what was meant to be. So I'm not sure what I should.
Now it's, yeah, now we can see other pages.
Okay, so I will quickly show the one before. So this is the graph I was talking about, where you can see the number of publications of translations, which is peaking heavily around 1900. And today I would like to discuss the second and the third wave, which are visible in the graph. Okay, so let's first take a look at the outline of the research. From the database, it is clear that Dutch newspapers published Russian fiction at a fairly consistent rate. My aim is to investigate the nature of these installments. To get a better understanding of the phenomenon, I propose the hypothesis that translated Russian fiction was functional in a newspaper environment. During the interwar period, 821 translations of Russian literature were published, 322 of them in left-wing newspapers and 499 in right-wing and other newspapers. This means that leftist newspapers, although small in numbers, make up 40% of the translations. The most prolific leftist newspaper was the Tribune, published by the Dutch Communist Party, which advertised itself as a division of the International and was strongly Moscow-oriented after the 1917 revolution. The authors that were translated most frequently are listed here. Chekhov is top of the bill. Left-wing newspapers published 51 stories out of a total of 149 translations of his work. He is followed by Zoshchenko, Gorky, and Avierchenko. These three are labeled as contemporary Soviet authors, although Avierchenko was actually ended up as an emigre writer. The list is completed by Turgenev, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky. I would like to focus on the four 19th century writers, so Chekhov, Turgenev, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky, because their presence is a bit at odds with the profile of a left-wing newspaper during the interwar period. So let me give an example of Chekhov's story, Drunk, as it was in Russian originally, was translated as Parasites, a sketch from Tsarist Russia, which creates a distortion. Parasites has a strong negative connotation, of course, and creates an image of the wickedness of pre-revolutionary Russia. Below, you can see a quote taken from a news item on Russia's new government. It comes from a liberal newspaper, and they actually do the opposite. They accuse the People's Commissars of being as wicked as Chekhov's characters. This shows that the boundaries between news and fiction were thin at times. The Workers and the Man with the White Hands is a story on a revolutionary trying to connect with the working class, was published in the Tribune. And the selection is very telling in this case because most stories by Turgenev are romantic ones, and for sure the ones published in right-wing newspapers. A third example is a Tolstoy story, How Kuznetsov Became a Revolutionary. This is a story which puzzled me at first until I found out that it is actually a part of the novel Resurrection. And Kuznetsov is a minor character in the novel, but turns out to be a main character in the isolated story. And once more, it fits with the agenda of the newspaper to portray revolutionaries. The next example is a variation to this selection mechanism, a text by Dostoevsky, which is presented as a non-fiction text, but in fact it is a large quote from the speech by the main character of The Idiot, one of Dostoevsky's great novels. It is a bit strange because he's actually predicting that Russians will be atheistic, which is strange because Dostoevsky was a very religious person himself. Then let me come to a last example, is an editorial quote by the Tribune on Gorky's The Mother, which ran as a feuilleton and was afterwards published as a book volume. The newspaper praises the book, which was actually translated by one of its editors, and it praises it as an item of propaganda, an unfortunately rare, beautiful, and emotional introduction in the revolutionary atmosphere, a welcome relaxation of the topical propaganda, and by doing so, it indicates that it was providing the readership with ideologically suitable deemed content. And this was actually the newspaper's strategy. So having seen these examples, I would like to come to a few preliminary conclusions. What do these examples tell us about newspapers, newspaper translations in general, and the interwar period in particular? First of all, translation is very present in Dutch periodicals. And I believe the feuilleton should be considered as a mode of publication in its own right and with its own characteristics. As a lowbrow medium, it represents another way of consuming literature. There's a strong tendency towards topical stories on the one hand, and as the examples have shown, when older prose is involved, with older I mean the 19th century authors, newspapers tend to make translations fit their ideological agenda. Extracts from the works of Tolstoy and others were for this purpose isolated from their original context. And when we look at the translations themselves, a large number of them is not only abridged, but modified in specific ways that seem to indicate editing coherent with journalistic practices, the so-called trans-editing. Additional research should or could confirm this. Finally, I will switch to the last or the penultimate slide. Finally, I would, as this is a panel on historically under-researched aspects of literary translation, I would like to suggest 3 preliminary questions for future research. It would be useful to assess the scope of translations in periodicals, as this is a big question up to now. It would be, secondly, good to find out more about the networks that existed to exchange both original works and translations. And perhaps the most urgent question is to get translators within the picture. Offering perspectives on the daily consumption of literary text and their cohabitation in a news-driven context, I'm confident that literary translation research can considerably benefit from incorporating the feuilleton in its research agenda. For those of you who would like to find out more about my research, I host a website. You can reach it via the QR code or you can just send me an email. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Gaëtan. It was really, really very interesting. And I'm also looking forward to the questions from the audience. But referring to the third question of this conclusive slide, so I didn't get any name of the translators that translated those texts, except for the text of Gorky, if I'm not wrong. So maybe they weren't named explicitly then. And my question would be, how can we know if the translations were done by literary translators?
That's a very good question. From my database, I can see that majority of them is unknown.
Are their names explicitly mentioned in the text, or?
In most cases, they are not. There are some which are using nom de plume, just pseudonyms, which are hard to find out who was actually behind it. I think what I've learned so far is that in some cases, newspapers had on their staff translators. This is information I got from another way, not because they are mentioned, but because I found documents stating the fact that they had a translator for this or this language. For sure, they were using freelance translators as well. And we could try to put all the pieces and try to figure out what was actually going on, because in the end, somebody had to do the translating. And I believe that the person of the translator is very relevant to research. But as I said, it will take a lot of little bits and pieces to get more information on that topic.
Mm-hmm. And even if the purpose of those publications was the functional and ideological, as you said, where was that an entrance for those authors to be published in volumes afterwards, or not necessarily?
I can't say at this stage. What I do know is that all of these authors already had been translated, not necessarily these works, but other works by them were already translated, with the big exception of Chekhov, who was very rarely translated in a book volume until the middle of the 20th century, when he, out of the blue, as is presumed, became very popular, which is not the case because he had been published in newspapers for hundreds of times before. With this, I mean his short stories. But the link between book publications and periodical publication is not easy. There are cases when entire novels are published in installments, and there is no book following up. To say that everything is a pre-publication is not correct in any way, but the fact is that from the 1950s on, pre-publication is more or less standard in newspapers. But before this, you have to see it as a different channel of publication, also in a way to make money. As a translator or as a publisher, you can get paid twice, once in the book volume and once in a periodical publication.
Of course. Thank you very much.